Alas, we are back. This is VikesNow, and we are in this, I call it awful purgatory, because the Vikings will take on the Lions. There's this slim chance, and the more I look at it, it feels like it could be possible for the Vikings to get in the postseason, but it's like a 14 parlay that has plus 3,500 money line odds, yada yada. Nevertheless, we are here in purgatory for the remaining 5-6 days of the 2023 regular season with Josh Frey, who's the boss man at Purple PTSD, recovering from an illness on New Year's. How are you, man?
I'm doing a lot better than I was a couple days ago. I mean, pile the illness on top of what was an absolutely horrible Vikings loss. I mean, it was a pretty tough weekend, but we're in purgatory now. I get to look forward to my favorite time of the year, which is the NFL draft. So I get to do that for the next
Mm-hmm.
4 months. So we're heading towards good times
Yeah,
now.
for your job, your career, this
Yeah.
is this is your Super Bowl. And regarding that Packers loss, it was a top four nauseating loss at US Bank Stadium. I can rattle off the other. The worst one, in my opinion, was the Colts game in 2016 when they had like a pretty decent chance if they won to get into the postseason. They got wiped off the map. I think it was 35-6 against the Cowboys last year, the hangover game after the Bills. That was utter annihilation. The infamous Josh Allen game against the Bills when the Bills were basically the Browns at that time. I think they were 15, 16-point favorites, got smacked. And then this one can be right there in the top three or four because it was the Packers and it was an elimination game virtually for one team. Bada bing, that was the Vikings, and the Packers, all they have to do is beat the Bears. But I will say this before we jump into Viking stuff, the Packers are in an eerily similar spot to last year, where all they need to do is win to get in, and they're getting a hot, somewhat upstart NFC team. Before we get into the Vikings segue, do you think the Packers get in the postseason?
I'm gonna go out on a limb and say the Bears beat them on Sunday. I think that defense is coming around. They've been playing really good football for the past couple months now. I think Bears have won 4 out of their last 5. Justin Fields starting to look like an NFL quarterback. I don't know. I think this Bears team is one. It's kind of the exact same story as the Lions, where they started out the season really poorly, and then they started coming on hot. And now they've got a game where they can play spoiler going into the playoffs. So I do think that the Bears are going to pull this one out. I don't know how the Packers could get in if they lose necessarily. But I mean, it's obviously possible considering the Vikings haven't been
Mm-hmm.
eliminated. But I do think that the Bears are going to win.
Yeah, I think the Packers is one notch. It's like a three-team parlay.
Right.
They would need the Vikings to lose, an NFC South team to lose, like the Bucks or the Saints, and then Seattle to lose
Seahawks.
to the
Yeah.
to the Cardinals, who suddenly are look pretty good. I think that would be the Packers' path. And on Justin Fields, I think it's awesome. This is exactly what we wanted to happen. We wanted him to get good, and that way the Bears can tempt fate and not draft Caleb Williams. We shall see what occurs. All right. We will put a formal autopsy on video next week. But to get us to start thinking about that with this glimmer of hope to reach the postseason, but more realistically to have a top 10 draft pick, give me about a 3-minute synopsis about this Viking season.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, first and foremost, it feels like this season could have gone way differently if the injuries hadn't come to fruition like they did all season long between guys like Justin Jefferson, Kirk Cousins. Those two guys just going down first and foremost, it feels like this would be like a 5-6 win team.
Yeah.
If for pretty much anybody else, if they lost both their top quarterback and top wide receiver for a good chunk of the season, and then throw on guys like Jordan Hicks, TJ Hawkinson, DJ Wanham, who was coming on right before he got injured. Like all these players that have been hurt throughout the season. Byron Murphy missing these last 2 games, I think, has been really huge too on the defensive side. So, I mean, you look at that, and I mean, the fact that this team 7-9 has a chance to finish right around 500. I mean, it's obviously not the spot that a lot of Vikings fans are hoping for
Mm-hmm.
after what happened last season and their 13-4 record. But I mean, you take all of that into account, and then the weird turnover problems that just kept on popping up week 1 all the way to week 17. I mean, 8-9, 7-10 isn't the greatest record in the world, and obviously going to be some disappointment among Vikings fans because of that. But you take the whole big picture into account, and I don't know how much better this team really could have fared with how they've shuffled through quarterbacks all throughout this second half of the season. They've had to rely on guys like Brandon Powell to be key pass catchers, Tristan Jackson to be top guys in the red zone too. And I mean, just that, and the defensive personnel wasn't the greatest coming into the year. They had Daniil Hunter and then Marcus Davenport, who didn't really pan out. I mean, that
You
was
called
kind of
it.
expected. That was a little bit expected, yeah. But I mean, you have one pass rusher. You've got an undrafted rookie playing starting linebacker for a lot of the year. This defensive personnel needs to get a little bit better in 2024 for Brian Flores to really be able to utilize that defense. And I think those chinks in the armor started popping up down the stretch of the season. So I think you do that, and you improve some of these spots. You bring some of these guys back in the offseason, and I think that this team has a bright future in 2024 and beyond. I mean, 2023 is going to go down as a disappointing season, but it's all sort of things that were not preventable, really. I mean, between the injuries and some of the turnovers could have been prevented, obviously, but there were some fluky ones in there too. So I look at this season as a whole, and I think Kevin O'Connell has done a pretty damn good job as his head coach this season, considering everything. So yeah, I'm disappointed in the record. Disappointed we're not going to see playoff football in Minnesota, most likely. But overall, it's kind of to be expected with what happened this year.
One thing that I think is kind of cool is assuming the Vikings lose to the Lions, it would be a very Viking thing for them to play their best game and then win like 30-10. We're like, what in the world? But assuming they lose, which is what odds makers forecast, they really blended a fun season with the roller coaster of Dobbs to make us think they could get in the postseason, and then ultimately still ended up with maybe the 12th, the 10th, the 11th pick. And it really speaks to the essence of a competitive rebuild because you had both inside the season. I mean, had they won one more game right now, we would have a totally different show. The whole community, Vikings community, would be like, all right, win this one and you'll be in. But it really came down to, one of the losses, pick whichever one. And you said when this Vikings season started to go pear-shaped, I think it was at 1-4, that you had them pegged for like probably 6-11. And they're really only one Raiders field goal off that clip, even though we got really hoodwinked into believing that Dobbs could be the thing at 6-4. They had an 80% chance to reach the postseason. So when it was all said and done, I think that in a dictionary, that this is what a competitive rebuild feels like. Like you're pretty darn good for a little bit in the season. You win 5 in a row. Bada bing, you look up on January, blah, 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 and hey, we have the 10th pick. I think this is how it goes. I had one question I wanted to ask you that was supposed to be a piggyback off of your synopsis is what is the path forward in Minnesota? But we'll get to that in a second. But I'm going to insert this question beforehand. If it were up to you, would you re-sign Kirk Cousins for, believe it or not, a team-friendly deal would probably be about $35 million while also drafting a quarterback, or would you prefer a clean divorce from Kirk?
I think at this point, I would love to see Kirk Cousins back in the Vikings uniform during 2024. I mean, you look at, first of all, the fact that they're going to have 28.5 million on the books, regardless of if he's with the team or not. You throw in an extra 6.5 million to bring him back. I think that's more than worth the price that comes along with it. If that dead money didn't exist, I don't know if I'd necessarily do that, just because you could afford to go get some other guys in free agency with that money, like an extra wide receiver, an extra guard, an extra pass rusher, something like that. But considering that they're going to have that money on the books regardless of if he's on the team or not, I don't see why you don't bring him back in 2024 because from weeks 5 to 8, I mean, that was when they were playing their best football, even without Justin Jefferson on the field. And Kirk was throwing the ball all over the place. That 49ers game is going to go down as one of the best games that he's played in his entire career against one of the most vaunted defenses in the entire league. And I think if they had Kirk all season, like I said, if they had him in the lineup, I think the season could have gone a lot differently for the Vikings. So I think even if it's in the spirit of a competitive rebuild, like part of that is still being competitive. So I think that they should look to bring back a competent starting quarterback in 2024. And then you go draft a guy. Maybe it's the first round, maybe it's the second round. Heck, maybe it's later on in the draft. But I want him to take a stab at a guy, but having him sit behind Cousins for a year and just learn the offense, don't put a ton of pressure on him. Like Jaron Hall, I think he definitely can develop into especially a competent backup with a couple of years, but I don't think anybody saw him in year one being thrown into the starting lineup. And that's just what happened with all the injuries. So I think you go get a guy somewhere in the draft, have him sit behind Kirk, learn the offense, don't put a ton of pressure on him right away. And then hopefully 2025 and beyond, they're ready to go.
I I assume, based on what Kevin O'Connell and Kwesi Mensah have said for about a year, a little less than a year, that Cousins will be back. That is my assumption, and for his sake, at a team-friendly $35 million, I think that would be a happy medium coming off the Achilles and being age 36. But I will say this: I will not bemoan if they decide to say, you know what, we're not doing it, because, in my opinion, the clock is ticking. Because Jordan Addison, he'll have 4 more years with the Vikings. You'll extend Jefferson this offseason. Hawkinson is good to go for 3 or 4 more years. And if it were up to me, I would almost say, you know what? If you're going to trade up for Jaden Daniels or chill and get McCarthy or Penix, let's start meshing that all together now so that year one isn't in 2025. Because I really want the core, Jefferson, Addison, rookie quarterback guy. I want them to have every chance to win the Super Bowl in that time frame. So for that sake, if Kwesi tells me, like, you know what, we're moving on from Kirk, we didn't know about the Achilles when we were saying all this rah stuff, I would be able to stomach it, because without paying all these dudes, Darisaw will be coming up too. I think that you're going to have a very precious offense first window from 2024 to 2027, because I don't think you'll be able to pay, let's say, Jaden Daniels is the guy, and he's legit. You're not going to be able to pay him, Addison, Jefferson, and whoever else comes along in that time frame. So that's why I am willing to say, you know what, Kirk, why don't you go play with Belichick for the final part of your career? But we shall see. On the Kirk part, so I want to ask you, and you can piggyback on the Kirk speech you just gave, or go in a completely different direction. What is the path forward for the Vikings? We'll be in year 3 of the competitive rebuild in about a week when this offseason starts.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I would love to see Kirk back in a Vikings uniform in 2024. But I'm kind of with you there too, where like you eventually you can't pay all of these guys, and it would be nice to have a rookie in there right away, who can lead an offense. Maybe it takes a couple weeks or something for him to get completely settled. But I do think that first and foremost, they do need to start looking for their succession plan to Kirk Cousins this offseason. It's been very clear over the past 8 weeks or so that guy is just simply not on the roster right now. Josh Dobbs had a couple nice games here and there, but then that inevitably ended up not working out. And then Nick Mullins, he's the gunslinger that we kind of all assumed that he was going to be. He's Brett Favre without all the talent. And then Jaron Hall just looks like he's not quite ready at the NFL level yet. So, I mean, looking at Kirk, even if they do bring him back, he's age 36 next year, coming off that Achilles. I mean, it's just as likely that he suffers another injury now that he's into his mid 30s and going into his late 30s. I think that they need to find a competent guy who can at least come into the offense and potentially take over in the second half if they need him to, or they just need to find somebody for the future who is ready to lead that offense, because right now it's clear that path is not, that guy is not on the roster right now. And then secondly, I think that they need to find somebody opposite Danielle Hunter who can consistently get after the quarterback, because Hunter had an absolutely awesome season. Obviously, he's heading into free agency now too. Hopefully they can bring him back as well. But again, money's very real in the NFL. You can only spend so much on so many guys. So I think they need to go find an edge rusher at some point too, whether it's free agency, the draft, plug him in next to Danielle Hunter. It worked out very well with Zadarius Smith last year, and they were hoping for the same sort of thing with Marcus Davenport this year. It just never worked out with his ankle injuries just continuously popping up throughout the season. So I think those are the top 2 things. And then I think they also need to find a cornerback somewhere too. And obviously these 3 things are areas where you only have so many draft picks, you only have so much money to spend in free agency. So I don't know if it's necessarily possible to find all those 3 things all in one offseason, but I think that those 3 things are at the top of my list, where moving forward, those are the things that Kwesi needs to address.
You're talking about Mullins. To me, he was like a gunslinger, but his gun didn't have a safety switch. It was like, yep. I was with Yannick Eckhart, who's been on this show before, at the game, and when Mullins came in, they got into first and something. I think there was a penalty, and he said it really doesn't matter. They're probably going to end up in 3rd and 28, and it'll be a touchdown or interception. There's no in between. It turned out to be 2nd and 28, and on the next completion, they converted a first down to Jefferson. It's like the guy is like the ultimate fun ride. Like, you're going to have it all. The only reason, back on Kirk before we move to final question, is The only reason that I would say, you know what, let's do the Kirk thing for another year or two, depending on what they want. If they, in their heart of hearts, deep in their bones, feel like they can win a Super Bowl with Kirk, then I'd say, all right, well, if you really believe that, let's do that. But if it's just, we want to make sure we go 9-8 or 10-7, then what's the point? Because if you're going to draft Penix, McCarthy, Daniels, Drake May, if you're trading all the way up to 2, like the goal is to win the Super Bowl, and it would just be half-hearted if they wanted to, be presentable with Cousins. So that's why I'm willing to be convinced either way. Ultimately, again, I do think Cousins will be back for 1 year, $35 million, and then boom, on April, blah blah blah, they draft Penix, McCarthy, or Drake May would be the dream scenario. I just assume Caleb Williams is going number 1. All right, the final thing. Probably knew this was coming. The Vikings are in the middle of this rebuild, and they have a 7-9 record right now. And even with an announced competitive rebuild, that's not good enough for some. They don't want the head coach around anymore. And then Jim Harbaugh's a national championship, so we should have got him. And so there's a anti-Connell sentiment that's developed over the past 3 weeks because the team is losing. And that's whether or not that's legitimate is debatable. But I want to ask you, if it were up to you, or wait a second here. Some Vikings fans are indeed lukewarm on him. Are you one of those? Or do you look at this like, hey, the guy's 20-13, like, what are you complaining about?
I mean, I do understand a little bit of frustration with O'Connell at times. Like, we talked about all last offseason, how the offense needed to be more balanced between the passing and rushing attack. And that just simply didn't happen. I do think, yeah, it got worse. But I think a lot of that also has to do with just the personnel that he's dealing with. Like, they don't have a true bell cow back in that backfield anymore. Dalvin Cook, when he took the job, was an aging guy on a very pricey contract, so retaining him wasn't exactly reasonable. And the guy that they ended up replacing him with, Alexander Madison, just proved that he's not really that type of guy in the backfield. And then Ty Chandler had a few nice moments, but he's a young guy who's also just an inconsistent back at this point. So I think that's one qualm that I do have with O'Connell at this point, but I also don't entirely blame him for it. I mean, the red zone efficiency was much worse this year, which I don't like either. But I mean, again, that could also probably be attributed to no Kirk Cousins, no Justin Jefferson, no TJ Hawkinson, So I think that there are valid concerns with O'Connell at this point, but like you said, the guy's 20-13 through his first 2 seasons. He led him to the playoffs in his first year as head coach. He's consistently at least kept this team in games. Like, they haven't always ended up winning those games, but they're at least being competitive. And for a guy who's coached for 2 years and dealt with all these injury problems, dealt with the dumbheaded turnovers sometimes, I just don't know how much of the blame can really go on Kevin O'Connell after 2 seasons as a head coach.
Yeah, I've posted that record in some context on Twitter, and some of the replies I get are, well, you remember how lucky the team was last year? And I swear to God that all of a sudden the Vikings and then Kevin O'Connell are the first sports franchise in history where wins and losses don't matter. It's like, no, you got to dig deeper and look at the stats, buddy. And it's like, oh, now we're saying that. It's mind-boggling. You talked about the need for a running back. Spoiler alert, this guy right here, all the next 4 months, I'm going to be calling for the round 1 quarterback and the top 2 running back in round 2, because I think we're just used to either Adrian Peterson or Dalvin Cook. And right now, I don't know. You'll be able to tell me better if a RB1, if there's going to be a running back in the first round. But because the Vikings actually have a 2nd round pick this year, I fully endorse getting one of the best running backs in the draft, because you don't have to spend a 1st rounder on it most of the time anymore. And then you'd have some conglomeration of Chandler, that guy, maybe it's the Michigan guy. I don't know how high Blake Gorham will go. But yeah, I really hope that to fix this running back problem that is very persistent and evident in O'Connell, whether it's his play calling or just the personnel, I think you can't just say, hey, we're doing Madison again, baby. So off the top of your head, who are the running backs, the big 3 to be looking for right now?
Yeah, so you mentioned guys that could go in the 1st round. I think the only real option there would be Jonathan Brooks out of Texas.
Okay.
He kind of has that Bijan Robinson feel, where he can kind of just do it all in the backfield. He's not going to go nearly as high as Robinson did, but late first round, I think he could go.
Okay.
Blake Corum, you mentioned, I think that he'd be a really solid target in the second round. A guy that I've had my eye on for a while, and has kind of gone a little bit under the radar, is Will Shipley out of Clemson. I think he's got just tremendous burst out of the backfield. He can catch the ball on screen passes. He's willing to block. He's got an explosive athleticism. He's got that burst to get through the line of scrimmage and gain those chunk yards that I just don't think that the Vikings necessarily have in their backfield right now. So if you want a guy that can run the ball first and foremost, but also allow Kevin O'Connell to use some of that passing scheme that he's more used to now that he's had 2 years in the NFL and has been doing that, I think Will Shipley is a guy. Maybe they don't have a third round pick right now, but Kwesi's going to be making some sort of trade at some point. So whether it's a third round, maybe even early fourth round, I think Will Shipley is a guy to look at.
And I will tell viewers that when Josh talks about the draft, take notice. All draft cycle last year, the 3 months, he'd message me on our Slack channel, like, Tank Dell this, Tank Dell that. And I'm like, Josh, we get it. Like, I was like, we're really going to put all our eggs in the basket of some third round receiver, and I'll be damned if he wasn't right. And you infamously, you were high on Quentin Johnson for a few weeks. And then after the combine, you said no thanks. And it looks like he's going to be the only one from the first round only receiver from the first round that's I don't know if he's going to amount to much, which makes sense because all 4 of them were never going to be Pro Bowlers, but I'll be damned if 3 of them aren't looking pretty good. All right, so we're going to have oodles of draft stuff, and we're just getting to that season. Next week, we'll do an autopsy and kind of evaluate some of those off-season needs from free agency. Vikings should have about $37 million. I don't know how much that will shrink if Kirk comes back, probably considerably. And then most of their draft capital. You got any closing arguments?
Yeah, let's go lose on Sunday and get a top 10 pick.
Yeah, I tweeted this, and I'm going to reiterate it on video. This is probably the only time even the anti-tanking crowd is like, you know what, just go ahead and lose it. I think we can all come together for about 4 or 5 more days.
Yep.
All right, man. We'll talk to you in a week.
Sounds good. See you then.
Yep. Take it easy.